Opening the door to the queen's Indian and English formations, this flank pawn push immediately stakes a claim on the queen's side. Securing the d5 square for a future pawn push, black embraces a solid defensive posture, prioritizing central control and potential pawn chain formation. Immediately seizing central space, d4 aims to dominate the core and prepare rapid development for an assault. Developing the knight here efficiently contests central space and prepares for castling, subtly hinting at a potential kingside attack. Developing the knight to c3 supports the central pawns and prepares for further expansion, often aiming to gain queenside space. Black boldly contests the center, immediately challenging white's pawn chain and opening lines for active piece play. Opening the center often hastens tactical exchanges, granting queens more influence over critical diagonals and files. Reclaiming central space efficiently strengthens black's pawn structure, setting up for dynamic piece development and potential central pressure. Unleashing the bishop here immediately aims for active piece play and central influence, potentially pressuring black's d5 pawn. Re-establishing central influence and preparing to castle, this develops a knight to its most natural square and supports the pawn structure. Solidifying the pawn center allows for harmonious piece development, subtly preparing to contest the d-file and potentially launch a kingside initiative once the minor pieces are harmonized. Preventing b5 expansion is the immediate goal, securing the queenside structure and limiting white's piece development. A flexible hand is played, developing the bishop to a square where it eyes the queenside and supports a potential e4 push, while crucially keeping options open regarding the dark-squared bishop's future placement. Initiating the fianchetto with g6 is a sound strategic decision, aiming to develop the bishop to a more active diagonal and bolster the kingside defenses, though it concedes some central space and might weaken the dark squares around the king if not handled carefully. Nurturing central control, this knight aims to bolster the pawn structure and prepare for a potential kingside castling, while simultaneously freeing the e-pawn for future mobility. Developing the dark-squared bishop to its longest diagonal immediately curbs white's central influence and prepares for castling, creating a well-defended kingside with excellent long-range observation. A bold knight outpost is established on e5, disrupting black's pawn structure and challenging the kingside, while simultaneously preparing to reroute for further pressure. Securing the monarch amidst the developing skirmish is a prudent choice, tucking the king away on the kingside and preparing for potential central pawn storms or flank attacks. Castling here secures the king's safety, aligning the rooks and preparing them for action on open files, while simultaneously creating potential attacking avenues along the kingside. Challenging white's central pawn structure with the knight's retreat, preparing to reroute it to a more active square, perhaps e5, to contest control of the center and potentially target white's king once it's castled. Sacrificing the knight for the pawn chain creates an open file for the rook and initiates a positional squeeze. Reclaiming the d-pawn opens up a central pathway for the queen, directly challenging white's knights and preparing to contest the now empty d-file. Establishing dominance on the open c-file signals white's intent to exploit the weakened queenside pawn structure and pressure black's slightly passive setup. Repositioning the queen from the aggressive d7 square back to d8 aims to secure the queen and potentially reroute it to the queenside or a safer central post, avoiding the immediate threats on the d-file and indirectly reinforcing the pawn structure against white's central pressure. The knight embarks on a peculiar journey to a4, aiming to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and potentially pressure c5. Although this maneuver temporarily sacrifices tempo and central influence, inviting black to consolidate their position and potentially launch counterplay. Shattering the perceived symmetry, black boldly injects dynamism into the center, aiming to disrupt white's comfortable piece placement and potentially open lines for counterplay. Seizing the open file with the pawn exchange dramatically alters the board's landscape, potentially unleashing a powerful rook battery along the newly cleared c file and initiating a critical battle for central control and pawn structure integrity. Reclaiming the pawn with the knight not only resolves the central pawn structure imbalance, but also reactivates the knight, preparing it to contest the now open c-file or support a future kingside initiative. Building a solid pawn structure is the immediate priority, aiming to solidify the center and prevent black's knights from finding comfortable outposts. This maneuver aims to create a potential outpost on c4 for the knight, and importantly, it safeguards the b2 pawn, which could otherwise become a target if black decides to push on the queen side. The intention here is to support the d4 pawn and control crucial central squares, a fundamental principle in this Slav-like structure where development and pawn integrity are key. Establishing a robust kingside defense and preparing for a potential queenside expansion are the underlying strategic goals, all stemming from this seemingly quiet pawn advance. Controlling the b-file for future piece activity and preparing to connect the rooks is a subtle benefit of this move. Unlocking the central files for your rooks offers significant counterplay, strategically challenging white's control of the d-file and preparing to contest the crucial e-file with dynamic pressure, a welcome change from the previous passive maneuvering. Initiating a powerful central assault, white redirects the queen to a more active square, eyeing the kingside and preparing to potentially exploit the open d-file with further piece redeployment. Returning the knight to c6 reestablishes a familiar defensive posture, but it also surrenders the initiative and allows white to solidify their central control, potentially leading to a restrictive game for black. Repositioning the bishop to f3 offers it a more active diagonal and prepares to contest the central files, potentially setting up future pressure on black's queenside pawns should they commit to further expansion there. Nurturing the bishop's influence on the long diagonal while preparing for a potential queenside pawn advance is a sensible developmental step, aiming to enhance piece harmony and contest central space more actively. Focus shifts to asserting dominion over the open c-file, aiming to pressure black's queenside and potentially fork pieces should the opportunity arise. Black boldly pushes the g-pawn, creating a pawn chain that aims to disrupt white's kingside and potentially open lines towards the enemy monarch, though this advance also weakens the dark squares around his own king. Repositioning the bishop to g3 prepares to contest the important light squares and aims to support a potential kingside advance or control the h4-d8 diagonal more effectively. Unleashing a pawn sacrifice to disrupt white's central control and open lines for piece activity, this move aims to seize initiative in a complex middle game. Sacrificing the bishop for pawn structure disruption, white aims to exploit the doubled pawns and open lines that arise, potentially weakening black's central control and creating avenues for knight infiltration. Embracing the doubled pawns on the c-file immediately reconfigures the board's dynamic, creating both weaknesses and potential avenues for piece activity down the open files. Unlocking the c-file for a powerful assault, white correctly identifies that the pawn push d4 has now created a concrete imbalance, and by capturing on d4, white seizes control of the open file, opening avenues for future pressure against black's kingside or potentially a deep penetration. This captures also disrupts black's pawn structure on the queenside, potentially isolating the a6 pawn later. The resulting pawn structure is a key feature to understand going forward. Unleashing a pawn storm to destabilize the kingside. 21. h5 dramatically seeks to pry open lines for the black queen and rook. This aggressive pawn thrust, while creating immediate attacking potential, also opens up the black king to potential counterplay on the kingside if white can reroute pieces effectively. The spatial commitment here is significant, potentially leading to a sharp, double-edged middle game where accurate piece play will be paramount. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure becomes paramount as white addresses the advanced central pawns with a defensive pawn push. Advancing the pawn to h4 creates a potential refuge for the king on the kingside, but it also commits the pawn structure and may offer an avenue for white's pieces to penetrate the now weakened squares around it, particularly if white manages to open the g-file. Shifting the bishop to e5 activates it on the long diagonal, eyeing the kingside and preparing potential discoveries. Unleashing a pawn storm on the king side is a bold gamble, potentially creating weaknesses around your king in exchange for attacking prospects. Shifting the bishop back to the flank allows white to potentially reinforce the kingside, perhaps preparing a later kingside pawn storm or simply bolstering the defense against black's growing pawn mass that now threatens to overwhelm white's central pawn structure, while simultaneously opening the g-file should an opportunity arise to harass the black king positioned on the queen side. Unleashing a pawn storm on the king side, g4 injects a dynamic surge, aiming to pry open lines and exploit the exposed monarch. Opening the h-file unexpectedly creates a direct assault on black's castled king, forcing a radical reassessment of defensive plans. Black liberates the bishop, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create attacking possibilities on the king side, leveraging the open g-file and the potential for piece activity. Opening the e-file with this rook immediately challenges black's pawn structure and hints at potential pressure along the newly cleared diagonal, aiming to exploit the weakened squares around black's king. Unleashing a pawn storm is a bold gamble, seeking to break open lines towards the enemy king, but it also exposes your own monarch to potential counterplay. Unleashing the queen to the queen's flank, this move signals white's intent to exploit the exposed nature of black's king after the pawn sacrifice, aiming to pry open lines and disrupt black's coordination before the doubled pawns on the c-file become too formidable. Unlocking the kingside potential with the bishop's repositioning, this move aims to support the advancing pawns and potentially create attacking chances on the g-file. Unleashing the queen to d6 offers a powerful centralizing thrust, aiming to exploit the slight disarray in black's pawn structure and potentially create mating threats. Embracing the complexity of the open d-file, black consolidates their queen, sacrificing a tempo to achieve a more cohesive pawn structure and prepare for potential endgame maneuvering. Securing the open d-file with the bishop solidifies control of this crucial corridor, anticipating potential threats and restricting black's piece activity for the long haul. Reclaiming a pawn is tempting, but the immediate recapture on g2 opens up the g-file for white's rook, potentially leading to a dangerous pawn storm against black's weakened king position. This exchange also misses an opportunity to solidify black's central pawn structure, which could have been advantageous in the upcoming endgame. The focus should perhaps have shifted towards consolidating pieces and preparing for exchanges rather than creating new tactical skirmishes that might favor white's more active rook. The king's sanctuary is breached, and white's monarch steps into the fray, aiming to reinforce the pawn chain and potentially activate further. Black's persistent pawn push has carved out a dangerous space for the king, but now the onus is on white to manage the immediate threats. This foray into the center, while seemingly audacious, could also expose the king to further complications if black can skillfully reroute their pieces to exploit the open diagonals. The battle for initiative is intensifying, and every tempo now carries significant weight. Reclaiming the initiative on the now open d-file, black repositions the rook, aiming to create active play and potentially challenge white's king safety in the upcoming endgame. Harnessing the newfound open files, the bishop retreats to bolster the pawn structure and create a defensive wall. Activating the dark-squared bishop from its passive post, preparing for a potential kingside assault, while simultaneously challenging white's centralized pieces and eyeing the open d-file. Reclaiming the open d-file offers white a chance to centralize their forces, potentially preparing for a coordinated attack on black's weakened kingside. The bishop's advance, demanding attention and forcing the opposing king's rook to a less active square, immediately creates a forcing sequence that disrupts white's newly organized defensive structure, highlighting the latent power of open diagonals once they are exploited. Relocating the monarch away from the open files, this king move aims to find a safer haven amidst the unfolding tactical storm, seeking to consolidate and regroup rather than stay exposed to potential checks. A desperate attempt to bring the beleaguered king to a slightly less exposed square, but the immediate danger from the open files and white's active pieces hasn't dissipated in the slightest. Reclaiming the e-file immediately after the exchange eliminates black's potential initiative, and ensures white can participate in the fight for that crucial open column. Finally confronting the rook, this recapture aims to simplify the position, potentially leading to a more manageable endgame where black hopes to exploit their central pawn majority. A strategic gambit to open the king's defense, embracing the subsequent pawn storm with a daring pawn sacrifice that promises to unlock lines of attack and disrupt black's currently solidifying pawn structure. Reactivating the bishop to its former square opens up lines of attack for black, aiming to exploit white's slightly exposed monarch by creating potential diagonal threats that might otherwise remain dormant. Reactivating the knight to the center initiates a subtle repositioning game, aiming to exploit the now static pawn structure on black's queenside and potentially create new attacking avenues. Unleashing a desperate check, black attempts to disrupt white's consolidating king and create chaos, hoping to exploit the slightly exposed monarch. Unlocking the kingside for an onslaught, this maneuver aims to reposition the monarch to a safer haven from the immediate threats, potentially preparing for a counterattack or a defensive consolidation on the other flank. The black bishop, having rerouted through h6, now lands squarely on f3, an audacious outpost disrupting white's pawn structure and menacing the newly crowned king's territory. Opening the f-file is the immediate, unavoidable consequence of this rook maneuver, giving your opponent a direct avenue to attack your vulnerable king, a potentially disastrous development. The black bishop, invigorated by the recent exchange, now swarms towards white's exposed king, creating immediate tactical complications. The exposed king, now further adrift from its defenders, faces a deluge of attacking pieces, suggesting an urgent need for defensive reorientation rather than passive repositioning. A devastating discovery, the rook's penetration through the newly opened g-file, coupled with the bishop's forcing check, has trapped the white king,